part of the reason we saw the activity disappear was that both it was a bit harder to access services, but it was also people didn't want to access them. And we saw that especially clearly on the acute side, but we've also seen it on the side of mental health services. So we've seen big drop in activity, particularly during the first lockdown. I guess over the summer things then came back, and we all thought the pandemic was sort of hopefully over, and then had a nasty shock in sort of autumn time when, lo and behold, schools and work returning and the weather getting a bit worse. The cases started to rise with new variants and so on, and then we had that kind of awful winter lockdown where, you know, I don't know about everyone else, but I found it particularly hard. And now that it's sunny again, you're sort of hearing all the horror stories that people have come out with, and the impact on NHS services is now really clear. It's you know, we've started seeing people, you know, flood back in is the right word, but emergency departments are really busy, busier than they've ever been, and elective waiting list is longer than it's ever been. And not only is it as long as it's ever been, but there's a load of people that still haven't presented that ideally should have, particularly cancer cases. But people are waiting longer for those services. I think when you then turn the lens onto mental health, we don't see as clear a picture. And there's a few reasons for that. I think there's something, and Tracy kind of mentioned this a little bit, but there's something about being distributed quite differently. So there's some really interesting analysis that's been done on the UK household survey, which has looked at how people's mental health has varied over the last few months. And, you know, there are some people it's been fine, some people it's not been fine. The ones that have been particularly badly affected are much more younger people, single families, more often women or people that are living on their own. So you've seen this really uneven split. And I think, you know, partly that means that services, or the need for services, has changed slightly. But partly we just haven't seen the impact of it yet. It's quite a long-winded way of sort of introducing, but hopefully that's helpful start, Grace.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. And I guess my sort of next question flows on quite naturally from that, and question to the whole panel, I suppose, is, given this, what do you think some of the challenges are, particularly for mental health providers, for the sort of year that's coming?
I mean, perhaps if I come in, Grace. I mean, certainly, I mean, from my perspective, it's clear that that the demand is increasing, and as George sort of said, we saw some really significant drops over the past 18 months for mental health services. I mean, in the first quarter of last year, demand for IAP services dropped by 35%. You know, in the one quarter, but we are seeing a steady increase since those sort of initial drops. You know, similar sort of patterns sort of emerging in children and young people's mental health services. I mean, as at sort of March 21, if we're sort of at a rate where about 26% above where we were pre-COVID in terms of referrals. So just to give you a sort of a scale of where we're at. In terms of how do we manage that? I mean, for me, there's kind of three key things that we need to focus, and rather than just focusing on what the NHS needs to do, I think it's very much what the system needs to do. So for me, three core things. One is what people kind of are talking about as a public mental health approach. So this is very much about supporting and preventing kind of emerging needs, and this is very much about normalising the feeling of stress, and supporting Londoners to build the resilience that we know that we have. I mean, what we're very much at the moment, what we're seeing is a very normal reaction to, you know, extraordinary circumstances, and typically, you know, when we're under this sort of level of stress, we would be reaching out to our normal coping strategies, like talking to friends, going for walks and going for these things. These sorts of things have been impeded over the last 18 months. So what we need to be doing is going through a process of re-engaging with those coping mechanisms and supporting each other as communities in order to support well-being more generally. I think there's a danger of over-medicalising some of this, and that simply sort of saying, well, everyone needs a referral into mental health services, and that's not necessarily the case. You know, there absolutely will be people that benefit from mental health services, no doubt. But it is about normalising that sort of conversation about distress. And the other thing about the public mental health approach is tackling those wider social determinants of mental health. So things that we know are impacting on people's mental health. So uncertainty around unemployment, financial concerns, debt, housing, etc., etc. So it's very much tackling those sorts of issues front on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is obviously there will be people, continuing to need mental health services, and new people who would benefit. So we need to make sure that people know that where those services are, how to access them, and that they feel safe to do so. And then we need to, as a system, make sure that the capacity is there for them to access it. And then the third element, which I need to throw in, is around health inequalities. So we absolutely know that the pandemic has had a very significant impact on particular communities. I mean, George talked about sort of young people, about women, single families, but we know also that from various research that BAME communities and other sort of ethnic minority groups have been disproportionately sort of impacted. We also know that, George mentioned single parent families, LGBTQ+, older Londoners, and people with existing mental health conditions. Because of isolation that they've experienced, and that sort of sometimes the levels of bereavement that they've been sort of exposed to has impacted, disproportionately on their mental health. So we need to be very much thinking about how best we can engage with those groups. So just some thoughts from me. I'll hand over to others for other thoughts.
I was just struck there about the kind of point you're making, Nina, between not medicalising and then also the where and how to access services, and kind of, I guess, a reflection of some of the work we've been working with local authorities in the kind of integrated care space, and seeing that, one, the way in which health is being consumed now, both in terms of kind of that some of the loss of contact time makes it harder to maybe identify. Now then, where as the health system kind of opens up more again and has this huge pressure on it, and everyone's working under, with these huge backlogs and with massive demand, again, harder to kind of get the quality moments that help for kind of when it is in a medical context, identifying and being able to refer in. And then I think, as you say, this, so how to access it has to be different, and has to involve a greater set of partners, and the use of place-based and locality type models, and hubs where you can have a range of services around your finance, your debt, your housing, all of which can help both alleviate, but also maybe provide other routes for people to kind of enter the system. And I mean that the macro system, not just the medical system.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think that continuum is really important. So good thinking sits in the well-being space, which is very much about self-care and developing your own coping mechanisms. I do think it's interesting, the use of the word resilience. I always think resilience is something that should be used at times of extremis. I think having resilience on a long-term basis is actually that means that there's something kind of seriously wrong that needs to be addressed. In respect of the inequalities, I mean, the stark inequalities were really illustrated to me by there's a street in Brent, some of you may have seen in The Guardian, and 46 people died in one street, and the majority of those were the breadwinners of those families. the impact of that on that Somali community was just immense. So we've been doing some work with some of those communities that have been most adversely affected. And we've produced resources that are culturally specific, culturally competent. We started off working with the Muslim community in Brent and in Newham, and we've now produced specific resources for them. Now, people have translated stuff previously, but this has really made us respond in a way that we always should have done, actually. And there's something about why didn't we do it before? We're doing it now, and the response from the Muslim community in Newham and Brent has been phenomenal. But those culturally competent resources have people in them, and I'm on my phone because we had technical issues, but have people in them that look like them, that are doing activities related to their faith, and that contain passages from the Quran, etc. So we've got to be. I mean, I've worked in the NHS all my life, and it does want the people who use it to come in a particular way that the NHS determines. And actually, this work is saying, actually, we're reaching out to you and producing with you. People have done co-creation, of course, but we are producing things with you for your community. So we're working now with all the world religions. We've got work going on with LGBTQ+, and we're trying to reach out to older people and men, because those are very difficult populations to find normally anyway. Within a pandemic, I think the challenges of working and finding with them are immense. So I think there's something about the spectrum of need, from the stuff that Nina supports and has described very eloquently, which is the service side, from right down to the awareness raising and self-care. And actually, one of the most critical things, and culturally this is often quite difficult, is what does a community use for its individuals to make them realise that they have got an issue. They've got an issue with their mental health, and that it is not something else. And that can be quite a challenge across all communities. Stunned silence.
Stunned silence. Well, you've touched on sort of some of your good thinking approach, and I guess that in that sort of innovative way of working, can you share a little bit more about how you did that sort of cross-organisation, population-based approach, how you went about it, and what are some of the lessons that we could learn and reuse the similar sort of innovative ways of rolling out this work?
Yeah, thank you, Grace. So we used our contacts in local authorities because they are much more embedded and within their communities. And actually, I think that is, as a starting point, something the NHS needs to think about. Now, I do know that a lot of the large trusts are much more involved now in their communities, and in fact, they have members. And in fact, I'm going to speak at an event at the Royal Free tonight with the Royal Free membership. But the lessons for the NHS is actually getting embedded in the communities that they serve, within the big hospital trusts. Primary care much better at that, but still a lot to be learned. And then working with in partnership with those communities. They are the experts in their faith. We kind of provided the scaffolding, which was the 5 ways to well-being, and they adapted that for their communities. Some of the lessons are that communities are not one size fits all, and they have their own challenges within them. There are different, for example, we're just working with the Christian community now, and they have obviously Anglican, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, some of the BAME churches, evangelical churches. So how do you get a voice that speaks to all of those, actually, which is of interest in its own right? But it is working alongside them. And some of the feedback we've had is that people have never listened to us before. We had a very emotional meeting with a Muslim community group, and they said people have not listened to us and worked with us in this way before. Now, that I'm not saying what we've done is unique, but it's the assets are really helpful for that community, but B, the messaging that we are working with them and for them and alongside them is really powerful.
That's excellent. And I guess opening this up to the whole panel, what are your reflections on, we've sort of talked about the challenges and some ways of working. What do you think mental health commissioners and providers will particularly need to sort of focus on in terms of working maybe differently going forward to address this elevated demand?
I've spoken a lot, so I will.
I mean,
Nina was going to.
Yeah, so just about being polite. So I think Grace, there's quite a lot of new ways of working that's already underway. I think one of the things that COVID has brought about is just people, to put it really bluntly, sort of mucking in, really very close kind of collaboration, and there is that sort of building on that. That's very much the whole concept of ICSs, integrated care systems. Nick, you mentioned place-based sort of working, that building services at a neighbourhood sort of level. Tracy makes the very good point about working with local communities in order to ensure that services are able to engage and support those communities in culturally sort of appropriate way. So I think it's about building on what's already happened. Rather than the commissioner and provider divide, I think it's interesting to think about kind of sort of also sort of more broadly thinking about primary care, thinking about secondary care, both in terms of mental health and physical health, and also the voluntary sector. And I think there's something about, and the voluntary sector is very much the sort of community groups that sort of Tracy's talking about. That's absolutely essential to building, really strong sort of mental health services that are able to face the demand and that we're seeing, and a lot of that work is underway. So one of the long-term plan ambitions is around changing or transforming community mental health services, and there's a framework for adults and older adult services, and that talks about very much neighbourhood-based community services around primary care networks, working with the voluntary sector, and across London. There's a couple of early implementer sites in North East London and in North West London, but now across London we're seeing those secondary mental health services develop and evolve. But it's not only just happening in secondary mental health. We know that in the IAP services, they are making really good use of working with community groups and things like that in order to reach particular groups that they know have been underserved traditionally from these talking therapy services.
Yeah,
that's a really good point, Nina. I think the other thing is that our services need to change. And they, as I say, I think we expect people to kind of present in certain ways, and I'm thinking of physical and mental health, and we need to change that offer and make it very different. And actually, in the children and young people's world, that there's a lot, because there are a lot of voluntary sector organisations delivering those services. You have things, for example, like football clubs where they've got mentoring schemes, and those are funded services to support young people who do meet the criteria, which is always a bit of a rub, who meet the criteria for being treated by a service, but different ways, so that you go into a football club instead of into a service that says IAPT, whatever IAPT means. I didn't know what IAPT was until I worked in mental health. So what do those look like that mean that they are attractive to people, so that they use them in a way that suits them? And the NHS and many health services are often like this. So it's not a particular swipe at mental health services, but I just think we need to make them much more responsible and adaptable to different populations.
Yeah.
If I were to add anything, it would be that what I find really difficult about mental health compared to the acute side is the lack of data. And it's just really hard to know the scale of it's hard to know what the problem is, and it's hard to know what the scale is. And because of that, it's hard to know what services you need to plug that gap and where they might need to be different. I found this household survey really interesting in that the pattern of need has clearly changed as a result of COVID, like the kind of the COVID impact on mental health. But like, there's not much else data out there data-wise out there that really gives a clear picture of where the problem sits, and what could be done about it. Nina and I were talking earlier about that there has been some people looking at suicide data to see if there's been any noticeable increase in suicide data, but even the suicide data, the coroners have backlogs, and to be honest, by the time it gets to that, it's already too late to really do as much good as you could do. And there's just a complete lack of where is the the real problem.
And the thing that makes me think, George, and kind of building on some of the other points, I have a real nervousness looking for. There's kind of simultaneously some real opportunity around integration, around, as we say, place-based, around the role of the local authority, around the role of the voluntary sector, around bringing together more tailored opportunities. The massive pressure that sits in the system on the acute side, and the massive financial pressure that local authorities are under, particularly from the the pressure financially that local authorities are under, creates quite a lot of challenge going forward. And what I worry, in the absence of some of that data, is that these become the services that are easier to cut. These become the services that are easier to vary your kind of service requirement and go to a statutory minimum, etc. So I do think that data point is going to become really important in helping to pitch the right kind of integrated service model that means that these individuals don't get left out as we come out of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I know across London, there's obviously the minimum mental health data set, sort of, George, which is collected sort of nationally. But in London, we tried to sort of make data more transparent. There's a London mental health dashboard, which NHS benchmarking sort of helps support, which provides sort of data across each of the sort of mental health services, which is a good reference point for anyone looking to sort of see what's happening sort of across the system in London anyway.
Yeah, and it's not that what's there is not good, it's just that the clarity on what is the underlying need is just not as clear as it is, say, for acute.
No, of course. I mean, they've been collecting data for many years, with the
decades. Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So there's the Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale, and you do get some of that data, because actually that gives you at that other end of the spectrum, because the mental health services data set is obviously people who are in services. That doesn't tell us about the population. Interestingly, you may not be aware of this, but in respect of suicide data, we do have a database in London of all the suicides, which is hosted by Thrive London. So that does give us some insight into that incredibly tragic end of the spectrum. But so we've got data on who presents to services and gets services, and we've got data on how many people want services and don't get them, but we don't understand the population mental health burden as a whole. And I absolutely take your point on that. So some of the mental health in schools work will help our data around children and young people, although sadly I mean, we virtually don't need data. It's just complete catastrophe for that whole generation. Losing school, being in lockdown, losing all those opportunities to develop. Our children and young people are a cause of great concern to me in terms of the effects of lockdown and COVID and job opportunities. And in fact, we do like innovation. So we worked with TikTok to undertake a survey with an organisation called Partnership for Young London to actually find out what young people were feeling in the height of lockdown. And interestingly, just participating in the survey said it made them feel better because it made them feel that they were contributing to something and were part of a kind of a group of people. They weren't supporting each other and contacting each other, but we did get some very strong themes coming out from that, and there's really not much surprise in what that illustrated. So I think there's also prediction, isn't there? How can we predict where demand is going to? How is that going to manifest itself? And we do know that eating disorder services are seeing huge increases in demand at the moment, which is one way of people trying to take control, is not actively, but that's how it manifests as a pathology. So we've got, our work is not done by any stretch of the imagination.
From the little data that we do have, do any of you have sight of any areas that are managing it particularly well? Any sort of exemplars for service offering in a slightly perhaps different way?
This might be slightly left field, but we've been doing some work on the video outpatient consultations that were, became a huge part of the NHS during the first pandemic, and then more so in the second. And it is certainly not, the panacea or the silver bullet, but the use of video consultations for mental health has been one of the big growth areas. We heard from, I think it was Imperial just before the pandemic actually, that they had been really successful using video for a number of people who didn't want to come into the hospital but needed to be seen. And actually having video meant that they didn't have to come into the hospital and they could be treated in effect, via video. I don't think it works for everyone, but certainly video has, it's been a component of the service offering, going to sort of Tracy's earlier point, that, wasn't there before, but ostensibly now is. And I think all the better for it. There'll just be the ultimate question of, it's not going to work for everyone, and just making sure that there's no, big problems sitting under the surface for that, which I think Nina probably add a bit to.
I mean, I know, so George, I mean, it is it's quite phenomenal what services managed to achieve over the last, year or so in terms of moving to remote working and supporting patients sort of remotely. Part of that was video consultations. A lot has gone telephone as well. And I think, it has, made massive sort of differences in some areas. So, I know across the prison estate, it has meant that, people can get treated without having to leave that estate. It also means, people sort of more generally in the community, lots of feedback about, being more convenient, shorter waiting times, that kind of thing. But it's now emerging that it isn't the panacea, that it is a bit of a mixed picture, remote consultations, and that there's been lots of surveys. A very recent one by Mind suggests that people have a number of concerns, both children, young people and adults, that going sort of exclusively to remote, they're sort of raising concerns about privacy, finding a kind of a quiet space at home or wherever they're taking the call, that they weren't always able to do that. that sort of mode didn't necessarily enable them to build a rapport with their therapist, which some find it's really important, and just concerns about confidentiality as well, not actually being there face to face in a room. So it's a mixed picture, and that's something that services are thinking about at the moment. What does the long-term trajectory look for this, for this innovative way of working? But it is, hands off to services. Just the way that they managed to, keep things on the road so very quickly when the COVID sort of hit. It really is incredible what services were able to achieve.
And I'd echo that, Nina. I think it once again kind of lends itself to thinking about what is a blended approach that is appealing to a wider range of people. Because actually, we've all been working from home, and that's got some disadvantages, but it has advantages too. And so how does an online offer, how does that sit alongside an existing traditional offer, and how do you find out who would want that? There is, of course, we can't talk about going online without the digital poverty or digital exclusion. Digital poverty tends to affect younger generations. Digital exclusion, older generations who don't want to interact with technology. So it's made us think about things differently. And so Grace asked, what do we want to learn and keep? I would say that we want to keep on thinking about, what are we offering, and is it what people want? That's the critical thing for me.
And what, with good thinking, what are some of the feedback you're getting from organisations and patients on that sort of balance that you mentioned, and overall, I guess?
Well, the good thinking is easy to offer a blended approach, Grace. So, but it is digital. Although some of our 5 ways to wellbeing and Islam, someone actually printed that off and put it into food boxes in a mosque, for example. So there are ways of getting around that. Good thinking has a blended offer because it has a variety of different modes of support. So it has workbooks that people can download and use or use online. It has apps, it has articles and blogs, as well as a self-assessment and links into IAP services and crisis services. So, but the key is, but it is mainly digital, and because that's what its intention was, in order to provide a 24/7 service for the population of London. And fascinatingly, the amount of traffic we get between midnight and 4 a.m. is significantly high. It's not as high as in the day, but people are looking for help at that time. If you can't sleep, then you're looking for help with sleep at 3 a.m.
I was going to add, actually, there was some interesting work done on logging into Facebook at 3 a.m. being a kind of a key indicator of stress and anxiety. I don't know, Tracy or Nina or Grace or Nick, if you've seen any of the work on that. But it strikes me that some of the social media firms, aside from being part of the problem, could actually really help shape some of the solution by just helping understand some of the problem a bit better.
Yeah, and there was that great piece of work, wasn't there, done around language on social media, and the use of certain words which you would not associate normally with people having a mental health problem or being suicidal. They were able to pick that up from social media. So social media can be an evil. We do use it for good. So we use social media marketing to find people who are looking for terms associated with mental health. We also use them to do insights work to find out what are people looking for. at 3 o'clock in the morning? What search terms are they using? And we did some very interesting work on that during COVID, and no surprise that people were looking for stress and anxiety in a way that was heightened from previously. So we do need to use them for good. We do need to get them to do some of that work for free. Because they are getting huge amounts of data from their users, and I would say that their corporate social responsibility buttons, we need to press those a bit more to get that, George, because those are all very, very powerful sources of data.
It's a good segue. I'm conscious we've got just a few more minutes left, and we've had one question in, which was, to manage demand, is it a case of more investment needed? Which follows quite nicely on this discussion. What are your reflections on that? And also welcome audience just popping in any more questions that you have.
I mean, from my perspective, Grace, I mean, there is a massive injection of investment going into mental health services at the moment as part of the long-term plan, and also the spending review recently. So very, very welcome funding, which, recognises, mental health services and, the parity of esteem with physical health. So very, very welcome. But it's not the only answer. And we've kind of touched on, some of the reasons why, Tracy sort of talked about, I talked about reconfiguring kind of services, in the community with IAP in terms of working with other partners so that we are kind of able to engage with all communities. So I think that's absolutely essential, and it is happening. That needs to continue.
Fantastic. Any other last minute reflections before I draw us to a close?
I don't know if you can't finish on this one, Grace, because it's not as optimistic as it would ideally be. But I guess one of the reflections I've got is that, aside from the problems with the data, I think we all know that, there was a big problem with, the anxiety and depression, particularly in the first sort of wave of COVID. And then for many people, the second kind of lockdown, or the third lockdown rather, was pretty traumatizing. I found it very traumatizing. So and a lot of my friends seem to as well. So I guess my worry is that, as we head into summer again, we all think COVID is gone. But this winter may not be the return to normality that we hope it will be. And so I suppose there's something about what can we do now, or what can we start to learn now, such that, this winter isn't as bad as it could potentially be. Because my worry would be that, it really does start to feel like it is going on forever. And I'm pretty confident that this time next year, things will be pretty back to normal. But I do think this winter is going to be especially hard, more so than expected. And I think that the burden of that probably will fall more on mental health this time than other services. So I guess it's just if and what should be done now, or what could be done now, whether that's something that needs funding or just legalizing hugs, I think has been a big step forward.
Great. Any other reflections or builds on George's comment?
Well, just really that, there has been amazing work going on. We need to continue to respond and listen and work with communities to make sure that what we've got is equipped to deal with if God forbid that we go back into another lockdown, but we just need to keep being as responsive and humble as we can, really, to listen to what people want and to start to deliver that against a huge kind of mountain of need. So the work is there is a long trajectory, I think, of work that we need to undertake, and there will be some interesting stuff that we can learn along the way and need to ensure is embedded and that we don't lose.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'm going to draw us to a close and just want to massively thank our panel members. You guys have been very insightful and inspiring, and it's exciting to see what I think the next year holds, albeit the mountain to climb. So thank you very much all, and thank you to the audience joining on this sunny day. I hope you can all go out and enjoy the sunshine before your next meetings kick off. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Grace.
Thanks,
Thanks,
for having
Grace.
us.
Thanks very much.
Bye.